Well, I'm from South America, I'm from Colombia, but there is a lot of things that we need to discuss here, and it's not only about South America, it's about the power of the countries. And I thought that there are two things that are important before we start with what happens with China. And the first one is that we did organize in February at Leiden University, organize a conference on the Belt and Road Initiative, where we provided the perspective from international law, from dispute resolution, from investment law, and from tax law. What is interesting to see is that in that conference, we did have a lot of people seeking information. So then there was a moment that we have to close the registration because the capacity was full capacity. But the question is, what type of people, representatives were there at that conference? And I thought it was interesting because when I look at the list of participants here, it's kind of similar. So for instance, we did have scholars, of course, we did have business associations, we have self-employed people who are also dealing with China, but also we have representatives of the provinces, and two provinces, Gelderland and Brabant. And when you look at Brabant, for instance, you look at Eindhoven. Eindhoven is high-tech, as everyone knows, because of the Philips and all these kind of things. So I was quite curious, asking, why are you coming to these conferences? Why do you need to know? Because you are from the province. So we are seeing then that the discussion of China, the discussion of the Belt Road Initiative, is not only a discussion that is taking place at country level, but at province level. And that's interesting. Also, we have representatives from the Minister of Foreign Affairs from the Netherlands, and we did have representatives even from the tax administration itself. So this is to show that this part of tax and the Belt Road Initiative is important. And if I see here in Belgium, I also see it in the Netherlands, and I think that if we organize conferences in Spain, we will have kind of the same type of people looking for information. So that's the first part. The second part is that we need to think about what role had China, and also the role of China with the G20. So now we have this, in 2016, China has the G20 presidency. Then it came Germany, then it came Argentina, and now it's Japan, and now next year will be Saudi Arabia. And the question we have is that when we look at the Chinese, and we look at the Chinese summit, they committed to do what the OECD was saying, in such a way that they also created an OECD International Tax Center in China. Please, I do not speak Chinese, so don't ask me to pronounce the provinces. I know there isn't a province there, I do not know. I wouldn't even dare to say it. So there was this OECD Chinese International Tax Center, where if you look at 2016, then we look at, for instance, the role that China wanted to play in this BEPS development. So when I look at the first speaker and I see if all the changes are taking place because of the Belt Road Initiative, I will not be that sure. Because what I see also is that there are two things, the base erosion profit shifting, and at the same time the Belt Road Initiative. And there are some kind of interaction between these two. And this is the challenge for us, and I think that's the beauty of this project. So then we have now Japan, for instance. When we look at German, I'm still with the G20, because China is also a member of the G20. When you look at Germany, for instance, there was two important things. One of them was tax certainty, that was also now taken up by the OECD. And another one, of course, it was the BEPS and this kind of discussion. Then we look at Argentina, and there was still possibility to discuss about taxation. I was part of the think tank in the T20 that was discussing or presenting recommendations to the G20 presidency of Argentina. And it was still possible. But what we see right now in Japan is Japan say, no, we are not going to discuss the tax part. We are going to let the OECD to give us the reports and tell us what we are going to do, because of course there is also this whole discussion about digital economy and so forth. And the only part where they look at a little was in the tax expenditure for pension systems. Of course, Japan, if you know, never been in Japan either, only in Hong Kong from Asia. But if you look at Japan, it's one of the countries that has a lot of people aging very quickly. So of course that was a topic that was important. I really do not know what is going to happen with Saudi Arabia. I do not think that tax will be such an issue there. So then if you look at the G20 and you look at what is happening with the countries and you look at who is feeding this information, you may say most of this information is being given by the OECD. And the OECD and the G20 are working together. What happens then is, if we look at then what happens then with China, but also what happened with other countries. And one of the things, and then I start with this global tax governance, why we are discussing global tax governance. And by looking at China, we also looking at what is the role of China in this global economic governance and the global tax governance. So then we have a project, a 5-year project, where we are looking at the implementation of BEPS in 12 countries. And those 12 countries, and I give you a map. Here, sorry. So if you have a map, you see 12 countries all around the world. So you see, for instance, Australia, India, South Africa. From the BRICS countries, we took South Africa, we took India. We are very careful that if we are looking at the implementation of BEPS in the countries, and we are looking at the national rules, that we do speak the language. Because that's the reason, for instance, that we didn't choose China, but now when I look and I'm reading a lot of information what happens with BEPS in China, I just wish I would speak a little Mandarin, Cantonese, so I could read this. But if you see, for instance, we have countries who are very European, so Spain, Ireland, the Netherlands. We have countries in Africa, Nigeria, Senegal. We have India, we have Singapore, we have Australia, we have the US, we have Mexico, and we have Colombia. Why we are choosing those countries? First of all, because all these countries are part of the BEPS inclusive framework, are members of the 129 countries who have committed to introduce these BEPS measures. But when you look at closely to these countries, some countries, like for instance the US, is going its own way. So it's saying, I do the BEPS inclusive framework, but I will not sign the multilateral instrument that will introduce some of the BEPS measures. Mexico is kind of the reference for South America, and also Middle America. And when you look at, for instance, in Australia, we have the diverted profit tax. So it's a country that, even though it's a good citizen of the OECD G20 BEPS initiative, they still introduce it unilateral measures. So we start looking also the countries, the level of commitment, and asking why are these countries participating in this BEPS initiative. In addition to that, we also look at the regions. So if we are talking about Africa, and of course you have to make the distinction between Northern Africa and Southern Africa, between English-speaking countries and French-speaking countries, or if you're looking at Europe, you are looking at Asia, of Australia, Asia, Oceania, or we look at Americas. So we also look at the regions. And this is part of the project that we are doing, that it takes 5 years with and I think it shows a little that it's not only that we are concerned about China, we are not only concerned about the EU, but this is a global issue. And there is a lot of research being carried out on this. So then, let's go to China. The question is, we are now discussing the Belt Road Initiative, and we may think that this is something quite new. But interestingly enough, when you look at Africa and you look at Latin America, I wrote a paper in 2019 for the European Report on Development, in 2009, sorry, in the European Report on Development, where we look at the framework for land acquisition in sub-Saharan Africa. And what happens is that there were a lot of Chinese companies who were also buying land. But in principle, in Africa, you cannot buy the land because the land is owned by the state. Yeah? So what do? You lease the land. For how long? 99 years. I mean, if you see a lease of 99 and you see a purchase, I mean, it's kind of the same. But anyway. So that's what happened, and this is 2009, when we are still looking at the influence of Chinese companies, influence of China in this land acquisition. Now we are also moving in the Belt Road Initiative, and we are looking at the infrastructure projects, for instance. So, of course, there are some, we have a blog where we try to produce a lot of information, and Chao Mei, who is here, also participated in some of these blogs. And you look at that, we are not only talking about land, but we are talking about infrastructure. Infrastructure in terms of railway, for instance, of port, and so forth. So, the question of what is the power of China and how China plays a role in this global economic governance is not from today, it's not from the Belt Road Initiative, it's not from 2015, but it's way before. So we are talking about 10 years. So when we look at the EU and China, I thought it was interesting to see, and I do not want to say too much about the EU because Marta already summarized in a very succinct way the work of the EU, so it's amazing what you did. But there are certain issues that we say that if we are looking at the relationship between the EU and China, we are looking that Europe is at the other side. So China is on the one side and Europe is on the other. And then the question is, how do you feel, how do you fit in that the other countries? So we may have EU, you have China, you have the US, and you have India, and the rest of the world, in my view. And what happens is that when we are talking about the EU, in principle, we are talking about all the initiatives that Marta summarized. So we are talking about the power of the EU, the role of the EU. A European Union wants to have a role in all these international tax developments. This is by means of the Anti-Tax Avoidance Directive, this is by means of the Directive on Administrative Cooperation, this is also by means of the Standard of Good Governance in Tax Matters that is not only applicable for EU countries but also for third non-EU countries. And this Standard of Good Governance in Tax Matters, it means transparency, exchange of information, fair tax competition or fair taxation now, and since 2018 the BEPS 4 minimum standards. So what the European Union is doing, or is trying to say, is that if we are talking about the OECD and G20, and we are talking about the EU wants to have also introduced these measures from the G20 OECD, means also BEPS. But, so we have EU, who is trying as much as possible to do it in a consensual way, because of course it's the EU, so you need the consensus of the countries. So far, I mean, of course, the discussion of the voting is the qualified majority voting of unanimity is another issue, but in terms of direct taxation, still you need the unanimity vote. So you need consensus. And then you look at, for instance, then China, but also you look at the US. So let's look at that partner, the US. So the US is also doing, I would say, whatever they want to do, if I may say that. Because the US is saying, we are part of the BEPS inclusive framework. We were one of the countries who started with this BEPS discussion, but we take our own road, our own avenue. What happens then? If you look at the measures, for instance, we're talking about the US tax reform, we are talking about the principal purpose test for treaty abuse, where for the US, there was an alternative. It was not the principal purpose test, it was not the limitation of benefits, but was similar to the principal purpose text that we call the conduit financing arrangements. So there is always a third option, and this third option is the US. So you look at the US and you look at this, I would say, in my view, a lack of commitment in a way to what the BEPS means. Because we are asking, remember, 129 countries in the world. We are asking to all these countries to commit to BEPS, but at the same time we are saying the US, you have the US tax reform, you have your anti-conduit financing arrangements, etc. So then, if we see these powers, then of course we have the discussion of India, but we are not going to go into India because it gets too much. And then, let's go back to China. What is interesting to see, and when you look at this role, I went really far away. What happens with this China in global tax governance? We mentioned then, and we have already discussed about exchange of information. So China is committed to all the instruments for exchange of information, on request, spontaneous, and automatic. This is important because, of course, it's not only about tax evasion, but it was also about being able to find out the information that the multinationals will, at least, will be able to tax the multinationals. So it's not only about individuals who have bank secrecy, it used to have bank secrecy and bank accounts abroad, but it's also about getting as much information as possible to tax the multinationals carrying out activities in China. So you see that China is quite committed to this standard of transparency and exchange of information. But one of the problems that you have is that even if you decide to say yes, you need to have the administrative structure to make this a possibility. And my question is, what happens then? We are talking about China getting access to a lot of information from companies, from individuals, and so forth. And the question is, are tax officials in the tax administration in China trained to deal with this information? Are tax officials in the tax administration in China aware that this information needs to be protected because of the confidentiality? Are tax officials in China, in the tax administration of China, subject to a monitoring process in the sense that if you have the information in this computer, that you know who is having access to this information, that you know that it's not going to be changed or amended by anyone else. So there is a monitoring process. Who is having access to this information and what are you doing? And in addition to that, the other problem you have with the exchange of information is, are you only exchanging with the tax administration? Because, for instance, in developing countries, we now see that the exchange of information is not only with the tax administration, but it's also with oversight entities. Oversight entities, for instance, if you are regulating banks, if you have, for instance, for money laundering purposes. So when we are talking about this, my question is China committed to this exchange of information? But is also China making sure that all the safeguards and the possibility to protect this the confidentiality of the information will take place? I don't know. However, if you look at this EU-China strategy agenda for cooperation that was mentioned in the first session in the morning, this deal is that they are reaching an agreement, they committed to reach an agreement on automatic exchange of information. I do not know to what extent, and this is not, the EU is helping China, for instance, with these pilot projects and so forth, to try to make sure that the tax administration is prepared for the amount of information that they will have to deal with, the amount of information that they will have to process. So that's a challenge. Then if we look further, I have 3 minutes to lunch, but can I have 5 minutes still?
Yes.
Yes, thanks. Because I don't want to be between the lunch and, yeah, okay. Anyway, so with taxation. So we have, of course, the BEPS. I'm not mentioning to you that anymore because we have already mentioned a little of that. What is important is when we are talking about BEPS, we can say that, for instance, China is committed to this BEPS inclusive framework, and unlike the US, is also committed to this multilateral instrument, because it's a signatory of the multilateral instrument. And I wrote 106, but I know that there are some treaties that are not yet in force, and that's the reason why maybe the difference between the 109 double tax conventions that you mentioned and this one, because I believe that there are some tax treaties that have not been have been signed but have not been ratified, so not entered into force. Yeah. So for 102 tax treaties are being covered by the multilateral instrument. So we say, so G20 member, Yes. Committed to BEPS inclusive framework? Yes. Committed to the multilateral instrument? Yes. But once you start looking at what the BEPS means for China, and you start looking at what type of actions they are taking into consideration, then is where it becomes very interesting, because you start looking at all the differences and the choices that China is making. And I thought, well, even though I try to read as much as possible, and I do not speak Chinese and I do not read Chinese, but it will be very interesting to see why they are doing that. It's lunchtime, no? She's looking at us. No. Wait. So, there are certain things, for instance, that, in my view, you need to understand the choices that China is making on whether China acts as a developed country or whether China acts as a developing country. When they are saying, I am a developed country, I'm a member of the G20, I want to have this important role, they also have a supporting role for developing countries. And they are saying, we are going to cooperate, we are committed to BEPS inclusive framework, and we are also going to help with technical assistance projects, because developing countries need that. So we are a developed country, China, and we are going to help developing countries. But there is always, and I think that the first speaker really mentioned this, and how important it is that there are Chinese state-owned enterprises investing abroad. That means that I will be, as a developed country, helping developing countries, but at the same time, I will make sure that my state-owned enterprises, my Chinese companies, will be protected. So then my question is, if we look back what China was doing before in land acquisition in 2009 in sub-Saharan Africa, my question is, how much of a developed country and how much of the developing countries you want to help? Because at the end of the day, for the part of the Chinese state-owned enterprises, you try to make sure that in the tax treaties you still get the protection. And then China can say, no, but actually I'm not completely a developed country, but I am also a developing country. So then China takes another route. And they say, well, I'm a developing country, the activities are being carried out here, and there is a source of economic activities, and therefore I also need to look at the BEPS not only from the perspective of developed countries, but from the perspective of developing countries. And then there are three elements that here are important. First of all, the treaty abuse. China is very concerned about what means abuse, but also about tax avoidance, also about aggressive tax planning. So then you have the general anti-avoidance rule, domestic rule, you have the specific anti-avoidance rules, and you have the principal purpose test of the BEPS. And the question is how all these three will interact, because is principal purpose test the most important one? Or if it doesn't fall under the principal purpose test, will always go with the general anti-avoidance rule? And in addition to that, for certain treaties, then China decides to do something different. So for instance, if we look at the tax treaty between China and Chile, they decided not only to introduce the principal purpose test, but also a limitation on benefits. Why is that? Because there was a 4% withholding tax on interest, and they decided we need to have as much as possible to try to protect this. But the question is also, when you look at this treaty between Chile and China, and it was interesting, normally when you talk about tax treaties, you look at the allocation of taxing rights between residence and source. So in this case, you say residence here, source here. Source is 4%. So you are trying to say, as a source country, I want to protect my 4%. So if you are going to use my treaty to use this 4%, I will add the principal purpose test and the limitation of benefits. I have to see how it works. But in addition to that, if you look at that treaty, and it's interesting because I have seen it in some treaties concluded by Colombia, but it's the first time I see a most favored nation treatment in this treaty. And funny enough, China was able to claim this most favored nation treatment because there was, I believe that there was another treaty between Chile and Japan. Yes, thank you so much. And another one with Chile and Italy, I think, also. Well, Chile and Japan. And they used this and say, look, me, source country, developing country, you are giving to them a lower tax rate, so give it to me as well. So you understand, this is resident source. I protect my 4% for principal purpose test, limitation of benefits, I'm the source. But when we look at the most favored nation treatment, we are no longer the developing country, we are the developed country. So we want to claim this 4%. I hope you can follow me. Xiao Wei does, but you know about taxation. So the question is, when China works as a developed country, when China acts as a developing country? And what does it mean this for this discussion? Interesting enough, for the ASEAN countries, or the countries in this area, they decided not that we will not have bilateral negotiation per se, but they have it, we include it in the multilateral instrument. Finally, as a source country, as a developing country, China is very active in the UN negotiations. So not only for matters of transfer pricing, and in this case the introduction of the location of a specific advantage, but also for the rules to deal with indirect transfer of shares. So then, for me, it's not yet clear, and this is the beauty of this project, how does it fit the EU and China as a developing and China as a developed? And what does it mean then for China? And I think that I would just leave it like this because it's too much.